Who would want to invest in a company that's run by people who range in age from 6 to 19 years old, and the average age is 13 and 14 years old? Anybody want to invest in that company? There's one guy on the front here saying, I did, it's called a .com. Kids aren't productive. Nobody would invest in that company. Kids are expensive. They're not just expensive to the families, they're expensive to the government. The government's got to build schools and hospitals to support these kids. Now, I'll tell you what, 1968 to 1982, the baby boomers were kids. They were draining on the economy. They weren't productive. They weren't adding to society. They didn't show up on the unemployment records. Our peak was around 10%. They didn't show up in that, but they were draining on the economy. Kids are very expensive. So, and by the way, I'll tell you also why Japan has the same situation that we had 68 to 82, slightly different reason. We had this baby boom where population quadrupled, and that doesn't happen very often. That happens less than every 500 years. We had a quadrupling in population. Now, all these baby boomers are productive members of society. They're in all the prime power jobs, and they're spending the most money. In Japan, they didn't have a baby boom. They had a baby bust. So that's why their economy is down. And that's why Greenspan couldn't change the economy if he wanted to. Greenspan doesn't have the power. You just ask Japan how much luck the government has in stimulating the economy. They can lower interest rates down to 0, and it's not going to affect when people make their purchases. What affects purchases is people, the Homer Simpsons driving the economy. People buy homes because they're the age that want to buy homes. You look at the baby boomers, a perfect example. In the 80s, all the baby boomers bought condominiums. You couldn't even pay to get on a waiting list to buy a condominium. And then when they all turned 39, the condo market crashed. That's the power of prediction. That's the mission of Harry Dent's company, is to help people understand change, to help people understand these trends. I'll show you another tool that we use. It's called the S-curve. The S-curve is a principle that, you can bring up the S-curve chart if you could. The S-curve is a way that we track what happens with, it's a couple more slides from now, what happens with a new industry when it starts to become, there we go, when it starts to become accepted by the public. It takes a long time for a new technology to reach that 10% penetration level. Then it tends to take off very, very rapidly. There's a shakeout around 50%, and then it continues to skyrocket until around 90%, and then it slows down again as the last most conservative elements of the population adopt that technology. Now, the economy itself also goes through phases. There are distinct seasons of the economy. When you had a huge generation of baby boomers entering the workforce, we saw an innovation phase. And look what happened when Bill Gates and Steve Case from AOL Time Warner and Steve Ballmer and Ted Turner and Larry Ellison and Craig McCaw were all young entrepreneurs. That's when we saw the innovation. Now, their companies didn't become really powerful until later when we had this growth boom. By the way, all those people are baby boomers. Almost all of the leaders, many of the leading innovators of our times are part of this generation. And now we're in the shakeout. So there are distinct times and seasons that we go through in the economy, and this also works on a micro level for individual products. I'll give you an example, automobiles. Next slide, please. Automobiles went from, they were invented in the late 1800s. It took until 1907 for 1% of the households to have automobiles. Once it hit that magic 10% number, 1914, and by the way, if you're thinking of investing in a company that's a fad, you are most likely a trendsetter if you're in a group like this. Be careful of what you like versus what the public likes. Until that reaches that 10% level, it can be a fad and it can always run the risk of dying out. Once it hits that 10%, it takes off. Cars from 1914 to 1928 went from 10% of urban households to 90%. That's astounding. I had somebody challenge me on this slide once. It's so challenging, I had to go get the source material. But it's true. 10% to 90%, that's astounding. Another example, next slide, mobile phones. Mobile phones, same kind of thing. The next slide, the internet. The internet, we experienced this firsthand in our lifetime. It's the same with mobile phones. The internet, when I founded Atlantic Financial in 1994, we were the first firm on the internet. Nobody was on the internet. You could tour Yahoo in an afternoon in 1994. There was about 100 links 200 links on Yahoo. Then it just, around 1996, AOL got on the internet and it just skyrocketed. Believe it or not, we're not at 90% yet. There's a lot of technologies like this, thank you. There's a lot of technologies like this that are in that middle part of the S-curve, and that's very, very exciting. So when you have exciting new technologies, whether it's the printing press or the internet, and you have a huge wave of people, in this case the baby boom, who's adopting those technologies, that creates incredible opportunity. And that is why we're in these times now. That is why things are moving so quickly. Sometimes you have to take a step back, and that's the other reason I mentioned Gutenberg. Take a step back and realize we are in an exciting time. This does not happen every century. There are periods of 1,000 years in history where people were fighting with swords and riding horses. 1,000 years later, they're fighting with swords and riding horses. In this century, we've gone from the Wright brothers' first flight to the space shuttle and the Hubble telescope. We've gone from barely anyone having electricity in their homes to Palm Pilots, PDAs, and cell phones in everyone's pocket. No internet, internet everywhere. It's exciting times, and this does not happen very often. Change can be scary. Change can be scary. Understanding these kind of trends can be scary, and I'll give you an example that, depending on your situation, you may not be ready to hear.